What's up and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Introduction to Comparative Politics. I hope that you're doing well. Thanks so much for being with me this morning. It's about noon where I am, so it's easier on me, although I usually wake up around the time that you're getting up for this class anyway. I hope that you're ready to get back into it. We're going to continue discussing unitary and federal states, and we'll do this by covering unitary states and talking about their characteristics and then taking on some questions that relate to them. But then we'll follow up with the first part of our lecture on parties and party systems. Now, that was the topic that we were supposed to discuss this week. We're a little bit behind, but I'm not worried about it because we'll be able to catch up next week, I'm pretty sure. And for all intents and purposes, we'll be able to cover what we need this week and next week. But thank you again for being here. And I'm very happy that you're here, despite that we have a paper due today, which many of you have been hard at work completing. I've talked with a lot of you about your ideas. We did a writing workshop here in this class, and things really appear to be coming together. Now, as a reminder, you do have today to submit that. I'm actually giving you through tomorrow to submit it as well. So I think technically the assignment link that I posted on CAT courses is open through tomorrow evening. And so I'm happy giving you that additional day. Frankly, we're under such difficult circumstances and I empathize with you so much that I want to give you the space and the latitude to complete this work on your terms and in a way that is manageable. And I realize that many of us are, without a proper workspace, or maybe we don't have a good internet connection. Many of us are navigating a variety of work and life issues and family issues as well. And so I empathize with you and I'm happy to accommodate you. And so you'll have through tomorrow to submit that. But I do look forward to your submissions, and I know that your TAs are very excited as well. We've covered so much ground in this class that we have a lot to learn from you, and we look forward to that opportunity. So before we get started, I just wanted to open it up to anyone who wants to make a comment or ask questions. If you think that there are any housekeeping issues that we should address, any administrative matters that haven't been covered, this is a space and a time for you to address that. So does anyone have any comments or questions before we get started? Thanks, Caesar. I'm glad to hear that I wasn't muted, but these technology issues come up. I think that many of us are familiar with technology, but sometimes it still catches us. I had to get used to Zoom when I began using it, and it's still sometimes a little unwieldy. For example, I was struck by the fact that I have to go online to my Zoom account to enable the breakout rooms. I don't know why I can't just do that through the Zoom portal itself. Anyway, but if no one has any housekeeping questions or issues, let's go ahead and get started with our continued discussion about unitary and federal states and the spatial dimension of power in states. So as you know, we've already discussed federalism and federal states, and we used a number of examples like India, the United States, Brazil, Belgium, and we talked a lot about how federal states do a good job accommodating diversity, linguistic, ethnic, religious diversity in some cases, because in a lot of these states, there are cleavages and there are divisions between different groups, and oftentimes these are territorial as well as ethnic and religious or linguistic. Federalism does a good job because it kind of appeases those separatist groups who might otherwise seek to secede or form their own state. And so the case of India was noteworthy because in India, the expansion of different territories and the sort of decentralization of power was driven largely by a desire to satisfy dissident separatist groups who otherwise were seeking to form their own state. A unitary state is very, very different. Unitary states are characterized by a concentration of power and a centralization of power. So whereas in India and the United States, power is decentralized to provincial, state, and local levels, in a unitary system, power is concentrated in the national level, at the national level. It's not constitutionally divided between different layers of government. Instead, it resides exclusively in the central government. And the local levels of government, though they do exist, depend on the center and are often accountable to the center. And so the national government, the central government, is the one in charge of making key decisions related to policy across the full range of areas that might otherwise be dispersed to provincial and state and local levels in a federal state. Now, unitary states are most closely associated with France. In fact, there's a French expression, the republic is one and indivisible. And France is associated with the unitary state because it's a place where power is very centralized. In fact, Edmund Burke, one of the most well-known classical conservative thinkers, was himself a Frenchman and wrote about the concentration of power in the unitary state in France as being emblematic of more conservative and frankly, more authoritarian politics. But the fact is that many democracies are unitary states, and most countries in the world actually are unitary states. And so in some ways, the unitary state is the norm, and the concentration of power that characterizes the unitary state is the norm in democracies. And so though it's radically different from federal states, it's actually much more common. And so let's take a look at the case of France. Whereas in a place like Brazil or the United States, we have states and we have different levels of government. In a place like France, we have no states and no provinces. In fact, we have a single French republic with the capital Paris. And that capital Paris looms large over the entirety of the territory. And so we know that France is a semi-presidential republic. We add to this now that it's a unitary republic as well. And so not only is power concentrated at the top in terms of the type of system, but the type of state as well also concentrates power at the top. Excuse me. The French Republic then is the most iconic example of a unitary state, precisely because of the tradition and the legacy of unitary state in France, but also the degree to which power is concentrated at the top. So I told you that unitary states are actually the norm the world over. And what I'm going to show you now is that same map that I showed you before. This shows us the distribution of unitary and federal states. Remember that the federal states are in green, and those include the United States, Mexico, Canada, Brazil. In this case, that's Argentina. Some other Latin American countries. Much of Africa, however, is unitary, meaning most of those African countries don't have states and provinces. If they do, there's very little power in the hands of those different levels of government. Power is concentrated primarily in the national government in most African states. Russia is a federal state, but many other countries in East Asia and in Central Asia are unitary. Australia is federal. Many European countries and most West European countries are unitary states, including, of course, France. And so this shows you that while some of the biggest countries in the world are federal states, many, if not most countries, are unitary. And there's one other thing that I want you to notice here, which is that the countries that are federal states are the ones that are typically more diverse in terms of language, ethnicity, social group, origin, all sorts of factors that might distinguish different groups. The United States, for example, is very diverse racially, and also in terms of the different areas of the country and the types of economies and the cultural sort of background. We know that Brazil is like the United States in that it's very, very diverse racially. We saw that in the Marx piece earlier in the course. We know that generally speaking, Argentina is a provincial system, a federal system, because of the strength of the provinces, but also because of the diversity. By contrast, countries like, I think that's Iceland, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe that's Greenland. I can't remember, I mix them up sometimes. But the point that I want to make is that West European countries, especially, tend to be relatively homogenous, linguistically, ethnically, racially. There are exceptions, like for instance, Switzerland, like for instance, Belgium, but countries like France and others are by and large much more uniform in terms of the sort of different cleavages that might exist inside those countries and the differences between different groups. Generally speaking, then, the unitary state is the norm. However, we do see the federal states more commonly in places that are more diverse. In a unitary state, most significant policy is made by the national government. We've already established that in the case of France, for example, Paris, the capital, houses, of course, the central government and the organs of the central government in charge of making the most significant policy. Now, it's also the case that the national government staffs the offices of the bureaucracy, and there's very limited scope for discretion at the local level. And so while elected officials might exist at the local level, they actually have very, very little power, and they typically are accountable to the center. And the bureaucracy is staffed in a way and created in a way so as to dramatically reduce the scope for action and discretion at levels of government below the national level. And so a really good example is education policies that are designed at the central level. So like a national school curriculum. We know, for instance, that in the United States, a federal state, there are national school policy goals and objectives. Remember, for example, the No Child Left Behind Act. That was a policy that was designed to implement certain kinds of testing in order to improve school completion rates and in order to kind of improve performance among students in school. But by and large, it's states who determine the curriculum in the United States. So for example, in Texas, it's well known that textbooks are written by the state of Texas. And in many cases, those textbooks have been written in such a way as to kind of dismiss the legacies of slavery or kind of apologize for slavery. Now, I'm giving you an extreme example, but my point is to show you that in a federal system, school policy is determined at the state level, not at the national level. But in a unitary state like France, it's the national level that determines that overall policy. And though those elected officials at the local level might have some influence, they don't have very much power whatsoever, and they're normally accountable to the center. So a really good example of a unitary state with a national school curriculum is the country of Chile. They have a Ministry of Education, much like we do here in the United States. But the difference is that in Chile, the Ministry of Education is in charge of designing national school curriculum. And all levels below the the central government in Chile are accountable to the center and must implement that policy and that curriculum. So there is no latitude or discretion for state officials. There is no chance for provincial or state governments to write their own textbooks. Those decisions are made at the top, at the very center. And in this regard, the unitary state is very different than the federal state. It concentrates decision-making power. It doesn't permit those state and local governments to make those kinds of decisions that would ordinarily be made by those governments in the federal system. So let's take a look at governance in the school system in Chile. So at the very, very top, at the central level, you have the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education is the main bureaucracy involved in designing national school curriculum. The Ministry of Education designs policies, it defines standards in curriculum, evaluation, funding, and support. At that central level as well, there are some other institutions that are associated with this kind of cluster of bureaucracies. Those include the National Education Council, the Agency for Quality Education, and then education superintendents. All of these different divisions of the central government education department are involved in designing these standards and these curricula. They're involved in auditing, in evaluation. It's at the central level where all of these decisions are made. They are not made at the regional or the state level. Instead, the regional and the state level, these levels are primarily in charge of implementing those national policies. So the educational regional secretariats, as they're called, are different divisions that represent different regions of the country. Those divisions have very little power of their own. Instead, what they're in charge of is implementing the national standards. There's also the education provincial departments. These are representatives of the ministry itself that are in charge of making sure that regional level policy implementation is in line with the central goals. And then there are regional units of education. This is also another form of superintendence and central control. What you see then is that at the regional level, not only are the agencies at that level in charge primarily of implementation of national standards, but they're also primarily staffed by representatives of the Ministry of Education from the center. Now, at the lower levels, you have the providers, which include municipalities, private schools, and delegated administrations. And then at the local level, you have the individual schools itself. So this is an example of governance in a unitary system. And Chile is a country that, like France, concentrates a significant degree of authority in the central government. And this is represented here in the decisive influence that the Ministry of Education has over policies implemented at lower levels. Now, as a reminder, in a federal system, it would be different. Much of those policies that are implemented at different levels are determined by the states themselves. And so I go back to my example of Texas in textbooks and the designing of textbooks by the Texas School Board. Ana Martha says, in Chile, the education system is structural functionalist, as in the US. So Ana Martha, I think that you probably know more about that than me. I don't know what that means. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that means? I think it's very likely that it is similar, but what does that mean?
Yes, because the education is structured to function in a capitalist country like this and other ones similar to this one. And a scientific study or materialism is used in other countries like Russia, I guess, Cuba, and maybe Venezuela. I am not sure, but that was my question, because structural functionalism helps to keep the government in its place, keep the power through education.
Yeah, so the more I think about it, I'm remembering that structural functionalism relates to Marxist theories of the state and Marxist understandings of the functions of the state. In the structural functionalist view is that the state functions to basically support capitalism and prop up this system of economic relations. In that regard, I certainly would agree that the system in Chile is much like the system in the US, that it's structurally functionalist. I think that there's room for debate about the extent to which the system is exclusively set up for that purpose, but I think it's indisputable that the school system supports the overall system of economic relations by kind of legitimating those relations. And I think that that's a good critique. And I think that moreover, it's consistent too with the idea of a unitary state, because a unitary state has more capacity to shape the course of events and influence the education and the teaching and the practices at lower levels. It is able to exert more control over education. And if the focus and the objective of the education system is to kind of legitimate and support capitalist economic relations, well, it helps then to kind of centralize power at the top of the state, because it can do that more efficiently than if you decentralize it. That's a very interesting perspective, and I'm happy to hear that you're looking at this from that lens. Marxism is one of the most important perspectives in all of politics and sociology and economics, and so anytime we use that, it's highly relevant to the discussion that we have about power in politics. So thank you very much, Ana Martha. So I want to show you something else here that's kind of interesting. We've been talking about COVID-19 in the ways that unitary states and federal states respond or don't respond effectively to the pandemic and the consequences economically, politically, and socially. And what I want you to see here with this graphic is that the degree of centralization or the degree of decentralization, if we're talking about a federal system, seems to be correlated with the level of subnational government health spending. So in countries that have a high degree of government health spending at lower levels, like the region level and the state level and the local level, those are countries that are primarily federal countries, like Switzerland, Spain, Australia, Austria, the United States. Some unitary countries have higher levels of spending, more than 40% of total public health spending, according to this data. Some unitary countries have that, but not many. The pattern seems to be that federal systems with more decentralization and more powers given to state and local and regional levels, those are the systems that seem to spend more at those lower levels on healthcare. Now, of course, we go and we look at the medium category and we find that this is primarily unitary states because, again, in a unitary state, when the spending happens, it primarily happens at the top, right? So there's not going to be much spending at the state or the provincial level. On the low end, we primarily see unitary states and many, many more of them. This means that in those countries that are spending the very least on healthcare at state, provincial, and local levels, those countries are primarily unitary states. And the reason, again, is because they're spending most of that money at the federal level, or excuse me, the central level. And so this is what we would expect to find when we look out at the degree of health spending that's taking place in response to the crisis. And this is what we should expect. We should expect to see that unitary states spend most of their health spending at the central government level, and federal states spend a substantial amount of their spending at state and provincial levels. This is also a nice graphic because it gives us a list of the different types of states. We see that most of the European countries are unitary, and most of those countries are spending very little of their health spending at the state or the provincial or the local level. We see that unitary states are represented at the high level of spending at the subnational level, but those are primarily going to be federal states that are concentrated at that level of subnational spending. So this is an interesting graphic, and it shows us then that the patterns that we observe are systematic, and the level of centralization affects the degree of spending and affects the distribution of spending in fiscal policy more generally. So what characteristics of unitary states stand out? Why are these states unitary? Why is France unitary? Why is Luxembourg unitary? Why are most European countries unitary? Why are they unitary and not federal? Well, I've already talked about the degree of homogeneity internally. How similar are people in terms of language, culture, ethnicity, race, etc.? What is the size of the country? These are all questions that relate to the characteristics of unitary states. These unitary states tend to be smaller. Why is that? Well, it's because when the state is small, it's easier to project power from the center. When the state is large, it's harder to project power from the center, and you've got to break the state up into smaller units and sort of disperse power to those units and control those units while retaining sort of the integrity of the entire state and retaining the kind of support and willingness to subordinate themselves of those different units. When the state is much smaller, it's easier to project power, and so unitary states are usually smaller. But when the population is also very similar, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, that means that it's also easier to win their willingness to obey and to support the central government without appeasing them with the decentralization of power or the creation of a territory of their own within the state. So when you have this population that's very similar in terms of language, ethnicity, and culture, it's easier to project power over them without appeasing them through the sort of territorialization of the country, of the state. And then there's also a colonial and sort of historical dimension. The fact that France has always been a unitary state, that's part of the story. Most French colonies, especially in Africa, adopted unitary constitutions. The reason is because they share a colonial history with France. France, of course, being the iconic example of a unitary state. Unsurprisingly, France often imported those same institutions and those same ideas about politics. Therefore, most African states seem to resemble France in this regard. These are the main characteristics of unitary states, and you can kind of see how they differ from federal states. Federal states tend to be much larger. Population is more heterogeneous and more diverse. And ordinarily, those federal states don't have a French colonial heritage. Isn't Russia a unitary state? let's go back and find out. Rady asks, is Russia a unitary state? I'm not going to tell you. I think I know the answer to that question. So this would be Russia here, this big one. It's green. It's a federal state. Russia is huge. And so, Rady, to answer your question, I think the reason that Russia is a federal state, probably a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a lot of internal diversity in Russia. There's religious and linguistic diversity. There's racial diversity as well, to a certain degree. But more importantly, it's a huge state. It's not small. And so that makes it difficult to project power across the entire territory without breaking it up into smaller units that must obey the center. And so because of its large size and because of that diversity, that's very likely the reason that Russia is a federal state. It'd be very, very difficult to maintain and exert control over that entire territory if it was a unitary state. How has China remained unitary? Good question, Alexis. How has China remained unitary? That's an excellent question. I don't know enough about China to comment, to be honest with you. I think that part of the story could be that historically China has been ruled by very powerful dynasties in very powerful centers of power and empires. It's an ancient civilization. And I think that the strength of those empires and the strength of those dynasties has meant that projecting power was more realistic. But to this day, China remains ruled by a one-party authoritarian regime, and it's a very strong state in the sense that it's very capable of projecting power. It's uniquely capable of defending the regime, in particular from opposition. I think that part of it could be the historical component, the strength of those dynasties and those empires. I think part of it could also be the continued strength of the Communist Party, but it could be a cultural thing too. My understanding is that there's sort of a collective solidarity and a collective mentality that really has a profound influence in a place like China. That could contribute to the capacity of the central government to project power. But I want to hear from anyone else who wants to answer that question. Why do you think China has remained unitary? Alexis asks this question, and I think it's such a good question. Does anyone have any ideas? So your guess is as good as mine. If I were to hypothesize, I would say that it has to do with sort of an ethic of solidarity and a collective spirit that really influences politics, the strength of the one-party communist regime, and the strength of those earlier dynasties and empires that ruled the country, the Chinese Empire for so many years, in so many centuries. But obviously, it's an interesting case, and I would encourage anyone who wants to know more about that, Rady, you included, to take a look at that case and try to find out. Excuse me, that was Alexis who asked that, not Rady. My bad. But despite all this centralization, there are patterns in unitary states that suggest that more power is being dispersed than before. And this is where the story gets interesting. Unitary states are defined first and foremost by the centralization of power in the central government. But increasingly, especially in places in Latin America, there's been a sort of decentralization of power. And what this has meant is that state and provincial or local governments are getting more and more powers from the central government. And there's sort of this dispersal of authority across these different levels of government that is helping to decentralize power in these unitary states. Now, the backdrop of this is that during the 19th and mid-20th centuries until about the 1960s, there was a tremendous degree of political centralization. There was a sort of rush to centralize power in these unitary states. But since the 1960s, as a result of decolonization, as a result of modernization processes, as a result of a lot of changes, socially, politically, and economically, there's been an emergence of counter forces that demand decentralization, that demand a dispersal of authority across these levels. And these groups have often been national and ethnic minorities inside unitary states who demand more authority to govern themselves. And there's also been a sort of technocratic and rational reason for this decentralization. The reason is that it's more efficient in terms of policymaking and implementation in some of these unitary states to disperse some power from the center to lower levels of government. And so what those areas are and what policies are more efficiently made at lower levels is sort of a question. And different countries decentralize different functions, but generally speaking, there's been a sort of movement towards greater decentralization. And so one way of looking at this is to look at what's called the Regional Authority Index. This is an index of regional authority in 42 democracies. And what it shows is that 29 countries regionalized and only 2 became more centralized between 1950 and 2006. So think about that one more time. 29 countries decentralized, meaning they dispersed power to different regions from the center, and only 2 became more centralized during that period of 56 years. That's a very decisive and systematic pattern. And this is especially evident in places in Europe and Latin America. Now, when we talk about decentralization, there are different forms of decentralization. And what form decentralization takes, like I said, varies from country to country. We can talk about political decentralization, where direct elections of state and provincial or local political office are set up, where maybe previously there were not direct elections. In many unitary states, those offices are appointed by elected leaders at the federal or the central level, Political decentralization means creating direct elections for state or provincial or local political office where they previously did not exist. Fiscal decentralization means decentralizing revenue collection and decentralizing spending. So whereas previously in the fully unitary state, the transfers came from the central government, fiscal decentralization means that the spending in the revenue collection itself comes directly from regional or provincial or state or even local governments. Policy decentralization is the transfer of policy responsibility from one level of government to another. So in our example of Chile, the decentralization of education policy would mean shifting or transferring education policy and curriculum design from the central government to provincial or state governments. Now that didn't happen in Chile, but that would be an example of policy decentralization. And then number 4, we also observe administrative decentralization. This is where implementation of policy is delegated to regional or local bureaucracies. This is where policy is still made at the central level, but the implementation of those policies falls to lower levels of government. Now, when we talk about centralization and decentralization, what we're really talking about is the extent to which power flows from the center versus flows from different sort of smaller, more local centers. So centralized means you've got this center right here represented by this central dot, which is sort of like the central government. And then you've got all these kind of lower levels that disperse out and take their orders from that central government. A decentralized system is one where you have all of these different lower levels who all sort of represent centers of power in their own right and kind of make their own decisions and govern themselves according to sort of their own characteristics. So one way that we can look at the pattern of decentralization is to look at the number of countries with elected mayors in Latin America. Now, previously and historically, these were appointed. They were appointed at the national level, at the central level. But increasingly, and especially between 1980 and 1997, there was a decentralization of direct elections and elected office for mayors. This was an example of political decentralization. So take a look. In 1980, only roughly 3 countries had elected mayors. If you go to 1997, you find that 17 countries in Latin America had elected mayors. Now, if this data is just referring to the 18 countries in Latin America who share a colonial history with Portugal and Spain, that means 17 of the 18 countries in Latin America by 1997 had elected mayors, whereas previously they had mayors who were appointed at the central level. This is a decisive pattern. It's a very decisive shift. It shows that this kind of regionalization in political decentralization is very much alive in Latin America. Now, decentralization is an important topic because on the one hand, it's lauded for dispersing power and authority and permitting states to organize themselves on a more local level. It lets people govern themselves and make their own decisions. It creates new spaces for the direct participation of different organizations, states and communities, etc. It's also supposed to be more efficient economically in some countries, but the record is actually quite mixed. It's not always that way. And actually, in some cases, decentralization has led to patronage and corruption and fiscal irresponsibility because in some instances, state and local governments have been incapable, of governing themselves effectively and making decisions that previously were made by central government officials. And so the record is actually quite mixed. Although decentralization does permit more direct participation, whether it does improve development is still a question. In some countries, it appears to have helped. In other countries, it appears not to have helped. And the problem does arise if policy is decentralized without fiscal decentralization. So whenever we make a policy, it always does have a cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And oftentimes the issue when it comes to the efficacy of decentralization is that if we decentralize policymaking without giving those same levels of government who now have policymaking authority the capacity to make fiscal policy and spending on their own as well, if we don't do those things together, there's a mismatch of policy making and fiscal policy and revenue collection. And that can usually mean big problems. And this is part of what undermines economic development in many of these cases. And so the precise way the decentralization occurs and whether or not fiscal decentralization comes along with policy decentralization matters a great deal. And this is something we saw in Latin America. And then also, when you decentralize power in a system where power was traditionally concentrated at the center, you run the risk of increased conflict between different levels of government. Suddenly you have more butts in the kitchen, you have more players. When you have those players, and when new players have been brought in and have new powers, sometimes some of those new players get a little bit headstrong. Sometimes the central government itself is reticent to hand over power to new levels of government. The level of conflict in these systems can increase significantly in situations where the different levels are unprepared to cooperate. So whereas federal systems are often designed that way to facilitate cooperation, decentralization in unitary states can actually undermine cooperation if the central government is accustomed to having power and if different levels of government who win power through decentralization become desirous of more power. So before we continue, I want to ask you, what are the pros and the cons of choosing a unitary state? Why would we choose a unitary state if given the option? Suppose we're writing a constitution and we have a choice between a federal state and a unitary state. Why would we choose a unitary state? Why might we not choose a unitary state? I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. I'd like to engage this question and think about the pros and the cons and the different strengths and weaknesses of these different kinds of state. But in this case, especially the unitary state. What do you think?
I believe that choosing a unitary system for some might be like benefit because of what you said of its small size and also of its national government making significant policy. So in some countries, the population might be just like a majority of one single race or ethnicity and etc. So like I think adopting a unitary system can allow like a diverse population, which kind of influences policy, which can benefit all and kind of create a more structural rather than a more polarized policy significance. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
So that's really interesting, Efren. It sounds like from your point of view, a unitary state might be good for countries that have a lot of diversity internally. Is that right?
Yeah, diversity because a lot of because it affects policy because like I said, like a diverse population may not feel representative. So this is an opportunity for like to include others and to like actually like get things done rather than a polarized like.
I see. I see. So from your point of view, federalism might contribute to polarization if you kind of give everyone, the capacity to rule themselves. Maybe in a more diverse country, a unitary state can be helpful because it kind of puts everyone in the same boat, so to speak. Now that's interesting, and that's an argument I hadn't thought of. The small size is also, of course, relevant. Efren mentioned that as well. Of course, I can think about reasons to choose a unitary state if it's a small state and you're thinking about, for example, exerting power or exerting control or extending control over the whole territory. If you are the head of state, a unitary state might be more desirable, right? Because you can more easily exert control over the territory that way. Maybe you choose a federal state if you have to appease secessionist groups, but your first choice might be a unitary state if your goal is to consolidate power and to really exert control. But that's only one consideration. There are other points of view that are going to be equally valid, and not just an elected official or a head of state makes this sort of decision. Manuel says a unitary state in a large country with distinct regional differences is unreasonable. I predict that there is going to be conflict at every level, but to Efren's point, it also has the potential to unify. Yeah, Manuel, that's why I thought Efren's point was interesting too. It's like, typically we think about federalism as doing a better job accommodating diversity, but I think that interestingly, there might be something to Efren's point. Like, if you can create a unitary state and bring people together and create that solidarity, that could be maybe even more useful than giving them all their own territory within the state, which would be the federal solution. Very interesting. Kevin appears to agree with Manuel. Anna Martha says United Kingdom is an example that keep an autonomous power. I think. I actually can't speak to the United Kingdom, and that's a little bit embarrassing for me right now. But if someone wants to chime in there, I think Anna Martha's correct. I just don't know anything about the United Kingdom. Caesar says, I think that a unitary state is more successful in a smaller population. It can also create more unity among the people. However, those in need might abuse their power and might lack the needed infrastructure to work out. So Caesar, certainly smaller populations might better accommodate a unitary state, since it's easier to exert control over that smaller population without kind of parceling out authority among different provinces or states. And it can create more unity among the people, as you point out. But I think that you're also right to suggest that when there's that concentration of authority, it might be easy to abuse power, right? Elected officials, heads of state might abuse their power. And moreover, if we don't have states and provinces and local governments with some authority or some decision-making power, we might not have the network of institutions and organizations that would be useful, say, in responding effectively to a natural disaster or governing the country during a crisis. The question arises, how much discretion, should we be extending to these different levels of government so as to maximize efficiency and to improve governance, to make sure that we're running the country effectively? The question comes up, is it possible to run a country effectively from the center? Or do you need to sort of disperse power among different states? That's an interesting question. Rady says a pro of a unitary state is that policies are made and enforced at a national level, which it kind of makes a stronger state. For sure, right? It can strengthen the state. It might make public service and public good delivery more effective. But Rady adds, on the other hand, a con might be that the lack of representation towards minorities and other cultural groups. For sure. So like the case of India, for instance, a unitary state would not have worked in India because there was a need to appease those secessionist groups by extending power to them and giving them their own territory within the state. Rady also adds, another idea that comes to mind is that it is easier to form a totalitarian form of government if there's a unitary state. Yeah, for sure. And there's actually an interesting example that comes from Mexico. Mexico was never a totalitarian state, but in Mexico, there's sort of a pattern in the past of conflict between governors and presidents or national political leaders. And in some cases, those governors have served as a check on the power of political leaders at the central level. And in the same way, I think Rady's describing the ways that the absence of those governors and the absence of those lower level officials might make it easier to centralize power and ultimately form a more totalitarian state. So for example, is North Korea a unitary state? I believe it is. I'm almost positive it is. And North Korea is the only totalitarian state that still exists in the world today. Although, interestingly, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state early on, but it was also a federal state. Anna Martha says, a unitary state is the opposite of a federation where powers are dispersed. Absolutely, that's true. And a unitary state, for that reason, carries with it a number of pros and cons that might affect everything from governance to economic development, to political stability, and other questions about maybe representation and the connection between citizens and the political system. Another consideration might be that a unitary state gives us fewer opportunities to vote on our elected officials. If you're a Latin American citizen, if you're a Peruvian in 1975, you don't get to vote on your mayor. You don't get to vote for a whole number of elected officials. The reason is because those people were appointed by officials and leaders at the central government level. And what that means then is there's just less for us to decide on as voters and as citizens. From the point of view of democratic theory and participation and representation, a federal state might be better because it lets us have more say and we get to directly elect more officials at different levels than if it was a unitary state. So maybe that's another consideration if we value democracy and representation, accountability. And there are a whole bunch of other arguments we could make too. I want you to continue thinking critically about this because these might be questions that you see again in the future. The reason that we think of these questions in terms of choices is because institutions are made by man and woman and non-gender conforming individuals. We make those institutions ourselves. They are humanly made, humanly devised constructs. What that means then is there's always a choice involved. When we write a constitution, we choose institutions. And so these are choices that are being made every day in states all over the world. Will we be unitary or will we be federal? And so as you go through this course, I want you to think critically about that choice and the various pros and cons of the two sides. So this brings us to the last part of our section of the course on the comparative political analysis of processes. And this section of this unit is on parties and party systems. There may be few things more important to democratic politics than parties. Obviously, democratic institutions like the presidency, the legislature matter a great deal, but it's parties that create, usually, the leaders and the office holders who fill those institutions and who make those decisions inside those institutions. Parties serve so many purposes that it's almost impossible to think about politics without them. In fact, to a certain degree, we take them as self-evident and we value them for their own sake, which is a characteristic of all institutions. The question that I posed to you at the beginning of the course in the syllabus was, why can't we do without political parties? What functions do they serve? What purposes do they serve? And what do they do in a democracy in particular? These are the kinds of questions that we're going to address in this lecture. And this lecture will begin today and we'll finish it on Tuesday of next week. Let's begin with a definition of political party. We will define a political party as a group of people that includes those who hold or seek to hold office and those who help get and keep them there. Now, political parties are organizations. They are vehicles, if you will. They are entities, sets or groups of people who come together for some specific common purpose, and that purpose is to hold office and to win office. And their objective is to not just hold office, but to keep office once they get there. Now, we can mention so many different examples. We can talk about the Republican Party in the United States, the Democratic Party. We can talk about MAS, the socialist movement in Bolivia, which just won the presidential elections. We can talk about the Workers' Party in Brazil. We can talk about the Social Democratic Party in Chile, or the Socialist Party, or the Communist Party. We can talk about the Institutional Revolution Party in Mexico. These are all examples of political parties. Another example is one that we haven't talked about so far in the course, and that's the Social Democratic Party in Romania. The Social Democratic Party in Romania is the largest social democratic party in that country. It's what we call a catch-all party because it has a kind of moderate centrist position where it seeks to get support from voters across the spectrum. But it's one more example of a very old political party that has very effectively held and sought to hold office and has very effectively kept leaders in office. The Social Democratic Party in Romania has been traditionally a very influential party in Romania, and it's been one that has done a lot to sort of set the agenda and set the tone in politics there. Kevin says, how would a country work if it didn't have parties? Did ancient Greece have parties, or even Rome? Kevin, to answer your question, there are some countries that are nonpartisan. Some political systems are nonpartisan. And where I'm from, for example, Nebraska, it's not a country, but it's a state with its own constitution, courts, executive, legislature, etc. The assembly, the legislature in Nebraska is nonpartisan. Parties are banned. Now, realistically speaking, everyone in the legislature in Nebraska has sort of an affiliation or is kind of somewhere on the ideological spectrum, but it's a nonpartisan system in that you're not distinguished based upon your party affiliation. So the way that works is there's some other means of sort of distinguishing legislators, right? It might be ideology or past voting. But in general, politics works not with reference to parties. It works with reference to maybe ideology or voting record. With regard to ancient Greece, I don't actually know. I don't think ancient Greece had parties. Obviously, ancient Greece had a very different kind of democratic setup than we have now, in that it was mostly an elite-driven system, but with the participation of masses. I can't really speak to that. I don't know much about it, and I don't know much about Rome either. And so sometimes when these questions come up and I can't answer them, I just kind of admit it, and I don't want to tell you something I don't know to be true. Yeah, their electoral college. Yeah, they also split up their votes by district. Nebraska is one of only two, I think maybe either one or only one of two states that split up their votes according to district. It's not winner take all the state over. So there's 3 districts in Nebraska, and sometimes one district will go blue and the other 2 will go red. So it's one of the few states that can technically go purple, if you will. But yeah, Nebraska is an interesting place for a couple different reasons. So I posed a question to you at the beginning of this part of the lecture. What is the purpose of a political party? Why do we need them? Why can we not do without them? What is their vital purpose in a political system that is democratic? Well, there really are 4 main purposes. And the first and most important one is they structure politics. Remember how I said, can we imagine politics without parties? Can we even understand the logic of electoral competition without reference to political parties? Can we understand the distribution of seats in a legislature without understanding partisanship or party identification? Can we understand voting and exit polls in a presidential election without reference to party? It's virtually impossible. The entire political world is structured by parties, and we understand politics as being shaped by parties. In a similar way, parties also are the entities involved in recruiting and socializing the political elite. These are the vehicles by which individuals who seek to gain office gain office. This is the launching pad, so to speak, for gaining office and gaining power. Even in a dictatorship where there's a single individual who has concentrated power, it's very likely that they came to power through the seizure of office by a political party, or they came to power through a political party. The case of Hitler, for example, extreme case, came to power through the Socialist Party, the National Socialist Party. He was democratically elected under the banner of a party. And in this way, parties are involved in recruiting and socializing the political elite, the leaders, the elected leaders in the system itself. But parties are also connected closely to the masses. As voters, for example, we ordinarily have partisanship. Some people are independents, but even being an independent only has meaning because it makes reference to what it's not, right? If you're independent in the United States, it means you're not a Democrat or a Republican. If you're a Green Party member in the United States, it means you're not independent, Democratic, or Republican or anything else. These parties are not just involved in structuring politics and recruiting elites, they also mobilize masses. And so if you've ever participated in a rally, or if you've ever made calls during an election, if you've ever worked in an office, or if you've ever worked as an intern with a party, or if you've ever done anything in politics, chances are it was organized by a party in some way. And the masses themselves are mobilized to vote by parties. Parties are the ones who are chiefly involved in trying to animate and kind of drive people to the polls. And then finally, in a similar way, parties are really important because they provide a link between rulers and masses. And so think about it. What is your relationship to President Donald Trump? Well, if you're a Republican, your relationship to him is that you are linked to him through your partisanship, through your affiliation with that party. And in that regard, President Trump is both the leader of the Republican Party, to which you belong, but also the president of the country. If you're a Democrat, President Obama was sort of the other end of the link between you and the Democratic Party. In this way, parties provide a link and they mediate the relationship between rulers and between voters or masses or citizens. And even if President Trump is the president, but you're not a Republican, the Democratic Party still mediates the link between you and Donald Trump, because the Democratic Party is the opposition party that's seeking to oust him and unseat him and beat him in this next election. And so parties, they're really, really important. And the point that I want to make to you above all is that the political world is virtually unimaginable without parties. Parties are very important for all of these reasons and many more. Now, when we talk about parties, not far off is a discussion about party systems. And party systems basically relate to the set of parties who compete regularly in elections in that country. Now, that's not the definition we'll use in class. I actually don't have a definition for you, but I want you to understand it as the set of parties who regularly compete for office and regularly win seats in a political system. In party systems, we use to categorize countries, and we categorize them in terms of different types of system. And the key dimensions that we use to categorize them are two. The first one is the number of parties. So how many parties actually have a shot at winning office? And then the size of the parties. What is their vote share? What proportion of the legislative seats do they have? What is their vote share? What is their vote share in the presidential race or the race for the executive, and so on and so forth? these are the ways that we distinguish party systems. These are the dimensions that we use to assess party systems. So there are 5 different types of party systems. And these different types of party systems are all distinguished based on how many relevant parties there are. So a nonpartisan democracy is a democracy with no official political parties. This is what Kevin was asking about. The truth is, I think that there are very few of these. I actually can't think of an example. I'm going to admit it. This is a type. I can think of the case of Nebraska, but even in Nebraska, the governor in the race for governor is partisan. So right now, Nebraska has a Republican governor, although the assembly is a nonpartisan assembly. A single party system is one in which only one political party is legally allowed to hold power. That includes, for example, China, Vietnam, Laos. Those are all communist one-party systems, or single-party systems where only one party is legally allowed to hold power. Now, a one-party system is slightly different. That's one where multiple parties might legally operate, but where only one party has a realistic chance of gaining power. So that's like Mexico between 1929 and 2000, where the PRI party, the Institutional Revolution Party, held on to power continuously and for all intents and purposes was the only viable party. A two-party system is going to be one where only 2 major political parties have a realistic chance of gaining power. So the obvious example is the United States. The US has many, many parties, but only 2 of those parties have a realistic shot at winning office, and those are the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, the reason often it has to do with the type of electoral system we have. We have majoritarian institutions where the winners of a district takes the whole constituency. A proportional representation system is different because the seats in representing a constituency are divided according to the proportion of the vote won by the different parties in that district. A two-party system is going to be slightly different. Another example of a two-party system would be like, say, Venezuela and Colombia between 1955 and 1990, or Uruguay more or less today. And then a multi-party system is one in which more than 2 parties have a realistic chance of gaining power. So that would include, for instance, Argentina, Chile, countries like Brazil. All of these different countries have lots of different parties. 2-party systems, of course, have 2. The differences between these countries are often very substantial, and the different party systems can have a really big impact on politics, especially in a place like Brazil, where many parties might exist, but where it's usually necessary to form coalitions between them in order to govern effectively. Now, as you know, I'm not one to take a detour for comedic relief or comic relief, but I did want to include a slide where we lighten things up just a little bit. The fun thing about political parties is that there often are joke parties. And like in the United States, we have the Church of the Militant Elvis Party. I don't know if you knew that existed, but did you know that there's a Guns and Dope Party? There are a lot of these joke parties in all these different cases that often come to mind when we think about relatively well-established party systems. So in the UK, there's the Mongolian Barbecue Great Place to Party. There's also the Monster Raving Loony Party. In the US, of course, we talked about the Church of the Militant Elvis Party and the Guns and the Dope Party. In Australia, there's the Sun Ripened Warm Tomato Party. And then there's the Beer Drinkers Party. And this exists in Russia and virtually every other country. And we don't quite have time to watch the video that I wanted to show you, but maybe I'll show you it next week. It's a music video made by The Best Party. It's a satirical party in Iceland, and they just make jokes about how they want like better roads and like, you know, more trees in Reykjavik. It's pretty funny. And there's more there that I include, but maybe I'll show you that on Tuesday morning if we get together and we're feeling light at the beginning of class. Brady says that sounds good. What, the Beer Drinkers Party or the Sun Ripened Warm Tomato Party or the Guns and Dope Party? I mean, they all sound pretty fun, right? Let's be honest. All of them, Brady says. Right on. Okay, so with regard to counting parties, sort of wrapping up our comic relief, getting back to the nuts and bolts of the matter, whenever we talk about a party system, the first thing we're involved in is counting the effective number of parties. And the effective number of parties is a measure that weights the number of parties by the share of votes or the seats they get. So the Church of the Militant Elvis Party, the Beer Drinkers Party, the Sun Ripened Tomato Party, those parties don't have representation. They don't have any seats. They don't win office. They don't actually compete effectively. And so they don't get included in the number for the effective number of parties in those countries. Instead, the parties that get included are parties that are, well, competitive and win seats, and especially those parties that are large in terms of the seats that they win, or the share of the seats that they win. So let's give you some examples. Two parties that each win 50% of the vote. This is a system where there are two effective parties because the two parties have the same vote share, more or less. A system with 5 parties that each win 20% of the vote would have 5 effective parties because each party would have a vote share of 20%, and then there would be 5 across the board. 5 parties where 2 win 45.5% each and the other 3 win 3%, that's a system where there are about 2.4 effective parties because we have 2 parties that both won a substantial proportion of the vote, and then 3 parties that win a tiny, tiny share of the vote. The point is that we calculate this by determining the relative sort of impact of each party, and that, of course, is based on their vote share. Of course, when we talk about the effective number of parties, we distinguish between the effective number of electoral parties and the effective number of legislative parties. The effective number of electoral parties, these are parties that win votes. That is, parties that win votes in the race. So there might be many more electoral parties than there are legislative parties. Effective number of legislative parties relates to those parties that actually win seats. So even though the legislature might only contain 2 parties, in that all the seats in the legislature go to those 2 parties, there might have been many parties that won votes, but that simply did not cross the threshold to win seats or did not win any districts to win seats. So the effective number of electoral parties will often be much higher than the effective number of legislative parties. But a system is especially consolidated where the effective number of electoral parties is about the same as the effective number of legislative parties, because that means then that the legislative parties are primarily the ones who actually win the seats and actually win the votes as well. So as we venture down this path discussing party systems, there are some important questions that come up. And these questions are going to frame the rest of this discussion and will help us to understand the core issues involved. What I want you to know right off the bat is that party systems and parties are much more interesting than you think. And let me explain why. It has to do with identity, in identity formation, in groups and social groups. Parties are not just these abstract, remote institutions and organizations that are so distant and so sterile and removed from us. They, in fact, relate to our identity and our social identity and our group to which we belong. And the point that this relates to is the divisions in societies that correspond with the divisions between parties. What we observe is that some systems are divided along ethnic lines, some are divided along class lines, others are divided along religious lines, others linguistic or regional lines. In these different situations, party systems are often a reflection of the different identities that exist in the country. And so where there's a lot of ethnic diversity, the party system will often contain a lot of ethnic parties. In African countries, for example, there are a lot of ethnic parties in the party systems in those countries because systems are divided primarily along ethnic lines. And those ethnic lines are themselves representative of different identities that exist in those places. And so identity is closely linked to political party and partisanship. This, of course, relates to the question of why some parties have many parties and others have few. Why do some systems have many political parties, 4 or 5 or 10, while other systems have only a few? And it has a lot to do, you'll see, with identity and with diversity, be it racial or ethnic or linguistic or regional. And this is where parties become really, really relevant to our actual personal lives. What began as something very abstract and very remote and kind of maybe unknown to you or sort of black box like becomes much more practical and down to earth and material when we think about, for example, the different groups in society and the different identities that they have and the ways that the differences between those different groups can then be kind of reflected in the parties that emerge to represent them. And so, for example, there's often a rural-urban cleavage. In the United States, an urban-rural cleavage roughly corresponds to the cleavage or the gap between the Democratic Party, which is more urban, and the rural or more Republican or more conservative party. And this is pretty spot on. There are red states and there are blue states, and the blue states are overwhelmingly close coastal and urban, and the red states are overwhelmingly agricultural and Midwestern or Southern, and so on. There are confessional cleavages that relate to religious differences, difference between Christians and Muslims, or Buddhists and maybe Muslims, and so on and so forth. These confessional cleavages can be just as important, and parties can emerge along those lines as well. There are cleavages between secular and clerical groups, those groups who are secular believing that there should be a separation of church and state, and those who are clerical believing that there should be a unity of church and state. To a lesser degree, this is in some ways the gap between the Democratic and the Republican Party as well. The far right of the Republican Party is a clerical group. They believe in a dominionist kind of interpretation of the relation between church and state, meaning they believe in a clerical interpretation in a unity of church and state. Now, that's only the far right of the Republican Party. I think most of the Republican Party doesn't necessarily support that. But if we are to identify the cleavage, it is indisputable that the secular party is the Democratic Party, and the more clerical party would be the Republican Party. There are class cleavages between workers and capitalists, those who control the means of production and capitalists, and those who work the means of production and workers. Oftentimes, if not virtually always, those different groups are represented by different parties. There's a post-materialist cleavage that relates to the types of jobs or functions in the economy performed by different groups in society. And then, of course, there are ethnic and linguistic cleavages that relate to differences in ethnicity and differences in language. I mentioned that in African countries, there are a lot of ethnic parties, and there are ethnic party systems. It's also that way in Lebanon. These places show us that different parties represent different ethnic groups. And it's also the case that different parties might represent different linguistic groups as well. These are the divisions that become really, really relevant to understanding parties and why there might be as many parties as there are in society. The question then is, why do these cleavages exist? For example, why is there one party for workers and one party for capitalists? Why don't they belong to the same party? If we acknowledge that these differences between the groups exist, the next question is, well, why do those differences become so important? Why don't they just belong to the same party? Why is it that rural voters and urban voters belong to different parties? Why don't they just belong to the same party? And the reason that this is such an important question is because it forces us to think about identity. And it forces us to think about identity formation and how people conceive of themselves in their relation to the larger whole. Are they a part of a larger whole, or are there boundaries or gaps between them and others within the society? What is their precise interest, or what is their sort of understanding of themselves? How have they constructed or created for themselves meaning in relation to others? This is where we're going to stop for today. But I want to leave you with this question. Why don't these different groups just belong to the same party? Why is there one party for different groups, for example, workers and capitalists, as opposed to a same party for both of them? And then more generally, what is the role of identity, and how does identity formation affect partisanship and belonging to parties, and then in turn the party system? So we are out of time. I'm going to stop the recording. I'm very happy that you were in with us today, and thank you for your contributions. We'll finish up this lecture on parties on Tuesday. I hope you have a great weekend and that you enjoy yourself. Stay well. Stick around if you want to make a question or chat with me for a while. But otherwise, I'll see you next week.